arrive. It'll be another 5 minutes. So I hope you are happy to wait in a nice cool room. It's a bit warm outside today. And chat amongst yourselves. Or even chat to us, perhaps. Do you have any pre-session questions? So 5 minutes only. Thank you for your patience. Oh, okay, fine. Yeah, let's do this.
Why don't you give us a little idea about the theme? Because when you all here.
Well, we're waiting for the venue coordinator. This is the protocol, I'm afraid. The venue coordinator will introduce us by name, and then I will introduce the two panelists more thoroughly when we're about to start. Otherwise, you can look in the program. We'll talk about values in the program. Something to kill the time.
Good on you.
Yes, I am. Good afternoon, everybody. In the absence of the venue coordinator, it comes out of the guest nation coordinator. So, my name is Andrew Collister. I'm the Vice Consul from the Australian Consulate General. It's really pleasing to see a good crowd in for one of the Australian sessions on this first day, Friday the 24th of January. A really special weekend here at the Heidke Lit Fest. And I just want to introduce the panel. Is there a men's fiction? We have Kathryn Hummel as our moderator, and she will introduce our two panelists, Lisa Heidke and Kim Wilkins. And I'll throw it over to you,
It's my pleasure to be moderating this session this afternoon with you all here. I'd like to introduce the two panelists. Kim Wilkins, to my left, is the author of more than 25 mass-market novels, including her debut horror novel, The Infernal, which won the Aurealis Awards for both horror and fantasy. She's been published in 20 languages. She was born in London and grew up at the seaside north of Brisbane, Australia. She is an associate professor of writing and book culture at the University of Queensland. She has enduring obsessions with Viking Age England, misty landscapes, pagan mythology, Led Zeppelin, and really, really small dogs. Lisa Heidke is an Australian author currently living in Sydney, where she teaches creative writing and popular fiction at the Australian Writers' Centre. She has written Lucy Springer Gets Even, What Kate Did Next, Claudia's Big Break, which was listed as one of the top 10 best-selling books in Australia in 2011, and Stella Makes Good. She is also the author of It Started With a Kiss and The Callahan Split. And I'm sure these titles are available in the book tent, are they?
Just this one.
Okay, there we are.
I'm carrying the book.
If you're curious. So, very, very tricky title of this panel. We were just wondering earlier who actually came up with it. But what it does is presuppose that there are gendered categories in fiction. Journalist Kate Harding has written that women's fiction is seemingly defined by the poles of misery and martinis. And another critic notes that books for women are supposed to have a thesis and are defined by a lack of moral ambiguity. How do these comments sit with both of you in your experience of women's fiction, particularly your own writing, if indeed you categorize your writing as women's fiction?
When I was growing up, there was this show for children on the television called The Smurfs. Did you have who knows the Smurfs, right? Little blue people? Right. And in the Smurf village, there was like Carpenter Smurf and Baker Smurf and Postman Smurf. And there was one woman, and she was called Smurfette. And so she was Woman Smurf. And so I think this is where my problem comes when we start talking about women's fiction and men's fiction, is that a lot of the fiction that potentially has a male readership is divided into other genres. It might be science fiction, or what does Thomas Clancy write? Submarine fiction, I think it's something like that. Submarine thrillers. And then when we get to what we call women's fiction, it's an enormous catch-all for something that is very, very nuanced and very different, and certainly covers, I mean, if you think that martinis and misery are on two ends of a spectrum, that's a very narrow existence. So yes, and both of those people who you quoted, were they both men? Well, they were both women. I disagree with them. In short, I disagree.
Okay. Yeah, I disagree as well. But I do agree with Kim in that what happens with... So I write for, I think, marketing purposes, contemporary women's fiction or popular fiction, but in marketing terms and in the bookshelves, when you go into bookstores, I'm either in romance, which is a part of my fictional writing, or women's fiction. Now, I defy anyone to walk into a bookshop and see men's fiction written there. Men's fiction will be under crime or sci-fi or thriller or just fiction, whereas for some reason women, and by women's fiction I guess loosely I'm saying books written by women predominantly for a female audience, although I'd like to think that my books also appeal to men, will be under women's fiction. Walk into a library, chick lit, women's fiction, romance, all of that sort of thing, whereas there's not a men's fiction. To the best of my knowledge, men read 20, roughly divided, 20% of men read fiction, 80% of women read fiction. So I think the term women's fiction is largely it's a marketing thing. And when I've been marketed as chick lit, and I really don't care. I mean, as long as people read my books and enjoy them, I don't care what you call them. But you don't find too many, even though there is lad lit. You don't go into a bookshop or a library and see lad lit, even though those writers might be doing coming of age stories, whether they're Nick Hornby, David Nichols, Nick Earls, but they're not classed under that, title. It's just called fiction.
Talking about the nuanced variations in what is known as women's fiction, just for the sake of this panel, do you find that there are any themes or characters or perhaps narrative arcs that appeal more to women than to men, or perhaps even people outside of a binarized gender?
Oh, well, I think that the statistics that Lisa gave us before said that, 80%,
8%.
Women will read across the board, whereas it's men, by the sounds of it, who are less likely to read in multiple genres.
Yeah, because they tend towards more the, sport biographies and the non-fiction and the autobiographies.
Well, and again, that's a generalisation, obviously. But I write two different types of fiction. I write sort of historical women's fiction, and I also write fantasy fiction, and I certainly get a lot more fan mail for my fantasy fiction from men, about 50-50 with women, where I think it's 100% of my fan mail for my women's fiction comes from women. I mean, in terms of what people are looking for in a book, once you get past the sort of whatever it is, those genre elements that attract you, like, you want someone to solve a crime, or you want someone to have long introspective thoughts about their parents, or you want someone to fall in love. Beyond those, what we're all looking for is just a great story where we can access another person's life for a little while and experience that and try and emphasise.
I agree. So I guess I write the sort of stories that I want to read. So my books are based in reality, and by that I mean I'm not writing medieval or historical fiction. I'm writing about the here and now. So, you know, when I'm writing a new book, it'll be set in 2020 or whatever it is. And really, I'm writing about women's relationships. Romance is an element of that, but it's women's relationships, you know, with their siblings, with their co-workers, with their children, with their parents. And it's, you know, and there are always very strong male characters in my books as well, because obviously they make up half the population and they provide good fodder for conflict and crises in many women's lives. So I guess what I write is about women's relationships and, generally speaking, women triumphing over adversity. But at the end of the day, like Kim says, I just want to write a good book, a good story that keeps the readers turning the pages and allows the reader to escape from their real life, read something of mine and go, oh, her life's much worse than mine. I'm so glad that I'm not her. But it always ends, hopefully, you know. I mean, you know, I'm cruel in the middle of my books, but hopefully by the end there's some, you know, catharsis.
It's so funny. When my very first book came out, I was quite young, and someone who wanted to give it a bad review had said, like most first novels by young women, there's an element of wish fulfillment in this book. And I went, which part of my life do I want to look anything? She makes a pact with the devil. How is that any good? But yeah, so that, again, some of the assumptions people make about women's writing are quite interesting.
Kim, I was reading a review of Marion Keyes' The Break that you'd written after that book came out, and you point out that Keyes' writing is dismissed as chick lit, suggesting there's something trivial and fluffy about her writing or about that genre on the whole. Do you consider the label of chick lit or women's fiction as derogatory and patronising, or in the tradition of taking and owning a derogatory label empowering, particularly since you write, you know, in your two different genres?
That's a really good question. I always feel really, Marianne Keyes, for those who don't know, is an Irish writer. They call her chick lit. It's definitely women's fiction. It's about women, for women. It's both hilarious and sad. You'll find yourself crying on one page and laughing on the next. And probably her most famous book, Rachel's Holiday, the copy I have has a picture of a woman with a suitcase on the cover, and it's actually about her time in drug rehab. So even the sort of the paratext that the industry has put on it is all around chick lit, whereas in fact they're much more serious. What was the question? Oh, a derogatory term. Yeah, okay. So there's a couple of things to think about here. In Australia, which I think follows the rest of the Anglophone publishing industry, the way that books sort of divided up into genres is quite, for sales terms, for sales tracking terms, there is a category called commercial. There's romance, there's crime, there's fantasy, and commercial women's fiction is a very large subset of that commercial. Chick lit, a publisher will use that if they think it will sell a book. As soon as that title has become, that label has become a bit passé, or it looks like it might work against them, they'll stop using it. So publishers only ever use those terms when they think that they'll work, and there was a big chick lit boom in the early 2000s, I believe, though it still sells very well. They do tend to call it women's fiction now instead. I haven't seen a great amount of owning of it, not in the same way that I've seen sort of fan communities of romance really owning and leaning into their term. And I hope at one stage today we can talk about romance, because though neither Lisa or I strictly write romance, it's the most maligned genre, apart from Western. Thank you for pointing it out, Anita. And it's 100% a women-focused women's genre, so I have some real issues with that.
Just to that, Marion Keyes is the person who got me into writing. So I was writing for national magazines in Australia, and I really wanted to write fiction, and it was really reading Marion's first book, The Watermelon, and I read it, and it was first person, conversational. There were serious issues at play, but exactly as Kim said, you're laughing on one page, you've got tears the next. And yes, she was very much called chick lit, which I don't agree with. But she's definitely the person who inspired me to write the way that I do right now. As I mentioned at the beginning of this session, I teach creative writing at the Australian Writers' Centre in Sydney. When I first started teaching there about 7 or 8 years ago, I was teaching chick lit. So I was the chick lit teacher at the Australian Writers' Centre. For the first couple of years, I had really full classes, and then the numbers started dwindling off. It had nothing to do with my teaching. I'm a superb teacher. But the title, people didn't want to attend a class called chick lit. So basically then, they changed the name to popular fiction. Principles, exactly the same. I changed a few words here and there, but generally speaking, the teaching didn't change. Still, you're talking about structure, scenes, dialogue, point of view, beginnings, middles, and popular fiction. That worked for a couple of years, and then they went, yeah, let's now change. So now what I teach is creative fiction, but secret. Basically, principles are all the same. And regardless of whether you write chick lit or thrillers, crime or fantasy, you still have to have believable three-dimensional characters, strong dialogue that moves the plot forward. You've still got to have point of view characters, and you've still got to have a strong beginning, middle and ending, and you've still got to have characters that people care about.
Kind of leads me into my next question to you, Lisa. I know you both have backgrounds in book and magazine publishing. But how much women's fiction is less about your writing with a particular audience in mind and more, say, about who publishes your books or how they're marketed, and with your journey in particular, who designs your book covers?
Let me tell you, Kim might be different because she's a much more widely published author than I am. I have no control, none. So, for example, I love this book, one of my favourites, my 5th book published with Alan Nunn. When we were discussing publishing this book, my publisher said to me, we're going to look for a much more aspirational cover. We want to have a much more literary cover. We don't want something that screams women's fiction or chick lit. Now, when this cover came through to me on my email, I went, well, goodness me, how much more chick lit could you get than those graphics and that woman? In addition to that, I, as an author, have no control over the title. So, for example, it started with a kiss. Again, could we get much more chick-litty than that? I don't care. I just want the book to sell, and I love the story. But what a lot of readers don't understand, and when and a lot of readers do judge a book by its cover, you've got to remember that authors, unless they're James Patterson or Marion Keyes, don't have control over their covers. And a lot of times we don't have a lot of control over of a lot of things, but particularly over our covers and our titles.
Oh yeah, well, generally speaking, I mean, I guess the rationale behind that is that they're the experts.
Absolutely.
And I just know so many fantasy authors who would love to design their own covers and should absolutely be forbidden from ever doing so. So I do kind of get it. My agent will go into that for me if it's a real issue, but generally speaking, I tend to well, not even trust them, I just tend to submit. I'm just so tired. I'm tired after 20-something years in publishing, and I just think, look, if you think that'll work, that's great. You go ahead and do that, make yourself happy. I got to write the book. I got some money for it. I'm already winning at life.
My next question, sorry, you've still got this mic. In Australia, we have the Stella Prize that awards only women writers. And in India, there are similar awards. I think one recent one is the Prabha Kaitan Women's Voice Award. Do you feel that these gender-exclusive awards are necessary? And I guess why?
Well, the Stella Prize was absolutely necessary. I think when they brought it in, it came in as our biggest literary prize in Australia is the Miles Franklin Literary Award. Miles Franklin was a female writer, was her real name Stella? Is that how we got the Stella Prize? Something like that. But anyway, she wrote under the name Miles Franklin in the 19th century. So already we've got one of those narratives of a woman who had to pretend to be a man to be published, like the Bronte sisters and so on. And so in the year that they introduced the Stella Prize, I think it had been a number of subsequent years when no women had won and hardly any women had been shortlisted.
Correct.
And then I think in the year that the Stella Prize started, it was an all-female shortlist on the Miles Franklin, and they were all like, see, we didn't need the Stella Prize. And everybody who's got any sense said, well, that happened because of the Stella Prize. So yes, to a certain extent we need them. To a certain extent, all of those kind of measures of value in any culture, any cultural artifact, so, you know, the Oscars, literary awards, whatever, there is the assumption of a rational white male somewhere in the middle of that judging panel. Whether there actually is that or not, that there is that assumption just sort of at the core of a lot of the ways that we judge value and a lot of the ways that we judge merit. And so I think a prize like the Stella is fantastic, and it's been a real success.
Just checking time here. I suppose, I mean, we have been dedicating a lot of this session to talking about what is women's fiction. But we did touch a bit about, you know, what is considered men's fiction. But based on what we know of women's fiction, does it follow that the inverse is men's fiction? Going back to the question of this session itself.
There's so many ways to answer that. I mean, like, you could say the history of literature is men's fiction. I mean, if you wanted to. You know, when you think of who was the most famous writer from the 16th century, Shakespeare, from the 17th century, 16th, 17th, I don't know, some guy, Swift, he was the 18th century. There's just all these guys, just a line of guys. And then lots of women started to write, and I can really totally understand why a lot of people would say, oh, well, you know, there's lots of women writers now, but there were so many voices from, you know, thousands of years past that we've never heard, and that makes me feel sad. In terms of the marketing category, that's where it gets super interesting for me. I love what they call men's fiction. I love James Patterson. I love Lee Child. I love Patrick O'Brien. I am the biggest Patrick O'Brien fan. So I do love a lot of things that, you know, men's fiction, the kind of thing they put on at the front of the bookshop around Father's Day. Yeah. Yeah, airports, so...
See, I don't consider it, it's annoying. You know, women's fiction, men's fiction, it's fiction. I read James Patterson as well, and Lee Child, and, you know, I can't think off the top of my head, but, you know, well, see, he scares me. But I read his books on craft and on writing. But, you know, I don't consider, you know, because it's written by a man, it's only, you know, going to be of interest to a man. Like I read David Nichols and, you know, Nick Hornby I really like as an author. And it's, you know, whereas So I think women are far more likely to look at a back cover blurb and not really care whether it's written by a man or a woman. If the story sounds good, they'll want to read it. I have friends who write crime, one of my friends, Louisa Larkin, and she writes under L.A. Larkin. Now, you could Google her and see that she's a woman, but, she started out just having initials so that men wouldn't be put off by the fact that she is a woman initially. And the same with Alison Tate, who writes for children, but they're predominantly adventure stories, and I guess more boys than girls would read it. So she doesn't write under Alison Tate, she writes under A.L. Tate.
That's the same for J.K. Rowling, that's why. Yeah,
Exactly,
that's why originally.
exactly.
Which is sad, right? That's like another version of Miles Franklin.
Yeah, exactly. Just because they don't want the stigma of going, oh my God, that book's written by a woman, therefore it's not going to be of any interest to me because I'm a man. Whereas I don't believe that the majority of women pick up a book and go, oh, that's written by a man, therefore it's not going to be of interest to me.
What about someone like Nicholas Sparks, who basically
writes romance.
Yeah, but they call it a love story when when a man writes it. So what's the difference there? Do you have any ideas of the difference between a love story and a romance?
No, it's well, I don't. Maybe you guys do. It's a romance. A romance is a love story. I mean, yes, of course, and if it look, I'm just going to keep it simple and straight. Boy meets girl, girl meets boy. There's the black moment. They have the argument. Yada 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 yada. Trials and tribulations, but. Basically, when you read a love story or a romance, you know the through line, and there are certain expectations of that genre. So you expect the boy and girl to meet in the first chapter, and that man and woman will end up together at the end of the story. That's the basic through line of a romance. That there's going to be hardships, difficulties, misunderstandings, but throughout it all, romance and love story, it's the same. You're falling in love. I agree.
We might actually open questions to the audience if anyone has something to ask either of our writers on the panel. Perhaps even continue this topic.
Can I just say, because we have just mentioned romance, the romance industry is worth $1.88 billion a year worldwide, and it's the biggest selling genre. They've thrown a bit of erotica into that as well, so now it's romance / erotica, but it is a $1.88 billion industry across the world.
And exclusive, and predominantly written by a woman.
Yeah, predominantly. Except for Nicholas Sparks, but he writes love stories. So we can't include him in the romance genre.
The thing that always gets me about romance is how often it's conceptualised as a guilty pleasure. There's actually nothing more important than falling in love. I mean, the continuation of our species depends on it. I've left out a few steps there that you can fill in. But unless people fall in love and form relationships, that's the end of humanity. So, in a way, you could argue it's the most important genre, but I'm not going to take that argument up.
Does anyone in the audience have questions for either of our writers? Yes, please, Anita.
It's perfect. I'm so sorry.
Thank you, it's Kat. It's been said that if Jane Austen published now, her covers would be fluorescent pink and sparkly, and she'd be the queen of chick lit. My question is, in Australia, most of us read Jane Austen in school, and dead white writers like Shakespeare. Did you read Jane Austen, and did you have a favourite title if you did?
My favourite Jane Austen, Northanger Abbey. because I'm actually fairly obsessed with late 18th century Gothic fiction, which is all written by women. It's these fantastic books, right? Like Mrs. Radcliffe, Anne Radcliffe is my favourite, and she writes these books where, you know, there's girls in an old building, you know, like an old mansion, and they can hear chains rattling and they think it's ghosts and it's terrifying, and then they find out it's not a ghost at all, it's just their mother who their father locked in the dungeon several years ago, so phew. I mean, that's much more terrifying, right? But yeah, Northanger Abbey.
I've got Northanger Abbey because I was just in Bath a couple of months ago, and that's where Jane Austen wrote that book. I've still got it on my shelf, but I would have to say Pride and Prejudice. But then my whatever number child was studying Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in year 11, and I reread that, and that is a fabulous romance. It really is. It's beautiful. So, yeah, I think it's very, looking at the classics. But I agree, she would most definitely be marketed with pink fluffy colours and, fluffy slippers and all of that sort of thing, shoes and handbags.
Yes, gentleman in the orange shirt.
Thank you. My name is Ramana, and I really enjoyed this conversation. The title of this session was, Is There a Men's Fiction? And most of your session was devoted to women's fiction. And you answered the question in the last 7 minutes or so, that yes, the predominant fiction is men's fiction. I want to contrast with an example. Khalid Hosseini, the writer of The Kite Runner. The first Kite Runner, the book that he wrote, The Kite Runner, was fascinating. There was adventure, there was thrills, there was, fighting and all kinds of stuff. Now the same author, Khalid Hosseini, I'm assuming you're familiar with Khalid Hosseini?
Is anybody there?
So he wrote his second book completely from a woman's perspective. The struggles that the woman had to go through in Afghanistan. And it's the same author. The second book was also extremely interesting, but as a guy, I connected with the first book, The Kite Runner, which was basically a man's story. The woman's story was also extremely interesting. It was very readable, but as a guy, I had to sort of struggle to understand the woman's emotions. Maybe that's my shortcoming.
It's not a shortcoming. I
Okay.
think that's perfectly natural.
Yeah.
And I would just even put a question mark over whether his representation of what a woman's feelings are for an entire novel would be that accurate anyway. So you're better off asking the girl.
And I would also say, maybe this isn't relevant to the conversation, but if we had a panel, we've got some very famous male Indian authors like Vikram Seth and Ruskin Bond, would they be up here talking about women's fiction? Would they have a panel dedicated to what is women's fiction? Have you ever been to a festival where there are men up here who would be then going, let's actually, is there a women's fiction?
I actually think that probably actually has happened.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Actually, Ramayana as a book has been written both from Sita's perspective as well as from the main Rama's perspective. There's an author, Indian author called Merchant. I remember
I know, I guess I
think we should
was being maybe I
There's
was
a lot of stuff that's
frivolous.
available here. So my expectation for the session was to actually understand what women's fiction would actually entail. What is the basic script that a women's fiction
There is no
entail?
script, that's the...
Or what are the differences or the contrasts that we look for? Because say, for example, can I classify a James Hadley Chase as a male fiction? Right? From that perspective, I'm just getting it really gross. What are the similar stories? Like Jane Austen would be again female fiction from that point of view of storytelling. So let me say, for example, Thomas Hardy. Bathsheba Everdeen, Far From the Madding Crowd, has got both the stories. He's got Gabriel Loeb as well as Bathsheba and that story. And Sergeant Troy comes into that. So it has actually been a mix. Now what is this new creature that's coming up with this called women's fiction? That's what we're talking about.
it's really, I believe,
So it's
it's a
more
marketing.
romantic?
It's marketing. We just write fiction.
Yeah, we just write fiction.
Or I do believe, fantasy is a genre, or sci-fi, or thriller, or
Well, I write fantasy about women. Yeah.
That's right.
I mean, this new thing that's coming up called women's fiction has probably been around as long as we've been around. We just haven't heard it. And I think there's a reason that we all know the name of the book, The Kite Runner, but we don't know the name of the sequel. And I think that's important to know.
Actually, segmentation. It's more of marketing that's actually happening over there. From the point of view of authors, you're creating a different genre of authors who are writing specifically about certain things, and they're classifying it into either overall fiction or men's fiction or women's fiction.
That's right, but yeah, I think it's probably a little more complex than that, but probably hard to go into.
Yes, and I'm afraid we have to wrap the session up as well. And I'm very sorry that we don't have more time for questions. Perhaps Kim and Lisa would be happy to have a chat outside out in the corridor, perhaps. So thank you very much.